All right, we're talking about camera basics, episode 2.
Don't be a stranger.
So today I decided we would actually talk about lenses. Now, unfortunately, I don't have all my lenses right now because I lended a few to my sister-in-law. I'm not sad about that because she's actually taking a photography class at the moment, so she needed some care. I do have a few lenses that allow me to do basically everything I need. So in the last episode, I mentioned that an aperture is something that allows light to go through, it's reversed, and you see an image. So that's essentially what a lens is. Lenses don't always have to be made of glass, but nowadays with our digital cameras, we shoot with lenses that are interchangeable with glass. So lenses actually work with different focal lengths. So what a focal length is basically how wide and how tight your shots are. So let's say I have this lens right here. Now this is a lens that's variable, meaning it zooms in and out. So this one is the 24 to 105 f3.5. Is that what you are? Yes. Now, unfortunately, it's not the greatest of lenses. It's an STM lens, which I actually really like. And that's because it's incredibly silent, even with the autofocus, or even just when you're racking focus on the camera. It's dead silent. No, like, you can't hear it. The motor is so quiet. I love that. Where on this other lens, it's not very great. Granted, I don't use this lens for filmmaking. This is pretty much for product photography or anything close up. This is a macro lens, that's why. There are several different kind of lenses. You have ultra wide lenses, wide lenses in general. Then you have mid telephoto and telephoto. Those mid telephoto are kind of like your mid-range lenses. And depending on what you do with the lens actually makes your images look a specific way, and that kind of makes sense because if you want to shoot a wider image, well, you need a wider lens. If you want to be zoomed in and shooting really tight, well, you're going to need a higher focal length lens, something like a macro, which we'll go over. So to start with my widest lens, I have this one's 24 to 105. So 24 is fairly wide. The lens on the camera currently is a Nifty 50, which is just a prime 50mm lens that doesn't zoom. And then we have the 105 Sigma 2.8 macro lens. Now, I don't use this one very much because it's just super tight. It's nothing like a 70 to 200. This one's a prime as well, so it doesn't zoom. This one does have an awesome optical stabilization, so it's really nice because when you are shooting a image or even footage with a focal length that high, any subtle movements of the camera actually seems very drastic on the footage. That's just what happens when you have a shaky camera and a high focal length. Everything's really shaky. You can avoid that by using something a little bit wider. So depending on what you're shooting, actually you might want to consider what lens you're actually using. Because if you're taking product shots and you're shooting them super wide, producers might not enjoy that look as much. When you're shooting photos of a product, usually you want to get, well, the details. You want to get a close-up, you want things to look nice. Kind of like this. So you just want to get detailed stuff. Now, if you're shooting a landscape, obviously you're going to want to shoot something wide. You want to see everything in the image. So 24, honestly, 24 is kind of my jam. 24mm is great. That's the widest lens I have. I do actually have something that's wider, but it doesn't fit on my 5D because it's a different mount. Now, lenses do have different mounts. Canon has the EF lenses, which is primarily what I own because they're cheaper, but they're not as high quality lenses. Well, the L series are, but my camera takes EF lenses only, and my other camera, the T3i, actually takes both EF and EFS lenses. The EFS lenses are actually kind of old and outdated, but that's the great thing about the T3i is it supports both models. My 5D only supports the one mount when it comes to the lens. So if you are looking for lenses, be sure to actually check of what kind of mount your camera has. So if you buy a lens and it doesn't fit, you know why, you got the wrong mount. You can find any lens online, as far as I'm aware, in a EF mount. I believe even some cinema cameras shoot with EF mounts, but even then, Cine cameras have interchangeable mounts, so it just kind of depends. So a wide landscape shot like this up here, well, it's gonna be a wider shot. So 24 is what I shot for this. And something for portraits like this photo of my wife, that was shot with at least 35 millimeters. A good rule of thumb for taking portraits is don't shoot anything wider than 35. And the reason behind that is when you're shooting something wide, there is something called distortion. We love distortion, not really. But it distorts people's faces a little bit and you may not really notice it, especially people who aren't really photographers. The average Joe might not notice this distortion, but it is there. So a typical rule of thumb for shooting portraits where you don't want any distortions within the image, don't shoot anything wider than 35. 35 is a good starting point, but for me personally, the 50 millimeter lens of any kind is usually perfect when it comes to portraits, whether it's people or animals. Now, when you have a higher focal length, you actually have this wonderful thing called compression. Compression is when your background is just fuzzy and out of focus. And then you're, like me for example, I'm in focus, this is out of focus. This is called compression. Now the compression I have on my current lens isn't super great because it's only 50 millimeters. But if you get something like a 70 to 200, those kind of telephoto lenses, which by the way are very expensive, they actually have this beautiful compression. So anything that's going to be out of focus is going to look buttery smooth. We love those pictures. The higher your focal length, the more compression you get when you're shooting wide like an f1.8. Compression, right there. When things are out of focus, you get things that are in focus, and as they go out of focus, they're blurry and they get a little bit bigger. That's what compression is. And when you have compression, especially with your different focal lengths, you pretty much eliminate what's in your background because it's so blurry in the background that it's unrecognizable. And in portraits, that's okay. You don't have to see the background all the time. If you're shooting family photos, you'll want to see the background most of the time just because, well, you're shooting a family photo. They should have a nice background. That's how it is. The 50 millimeter lens I'm using right now is shooting at 1.8. So if you remember, the wider that aperture, the less depth of field. So only this is in focus and this is out of focus. And this out of focus element is compression. Now there's more or less compression when you're shooting at different focal lengths. So the higher it is, more compression, which is beautiful. Once you get really good compression, the amount of zoom you have, the higher the focal length, it doesn't quite matter at that point. It just depends on how far away you are and how close you want to zoom in. But other than that, it doesn't matter. Ultimately, in my opinion, I don't shoot anything higher than 105. And I believe that's actually 105 for both of these. Yes. So this lens is a zoom lens, and this goes to 24 to 105, like I mentioned. And it's nice. This goes to 105, and this is a prime set at 105 and stays that way. The only difference between these two is this one actually zooms in and out, and this one doesn't. And this one has actually a wider aperture than this one, which is why I bought this lens in the first place. This one is a 2.8 and this one is a 3.5. Unfortunately, they're not as wide as I'd like them to be. The widest lens I own is the one on the camera right now, which is the 50-50. Now, the great thing about the Nifty 50, while I'm on topic, is it's actually a really cheap lens, and that's why they call it a Nifty 50, because it's cheap and it's reliable, and it's a really good all-around lens for its price range. So it's actually quite great. A lens like this is a Sigma brand, this isn't Canon, and I know in my last video I said I strictly shoot Canon. That came to the camera bodies themselves. When it comes to lenses, my primary choice is Canon and Sigma actually. I only own one Sigma lens. The 50mm 1.8 lens I have on the camera right now is really nice when it comes to dark situations because it's wide. It allows more light in. So when it comes to a dark situation, usually I throw that lens on instead of this one. Especially with that one being a higher focal length, I can actually shoot portraits in a darker scenario. and actually get really nice images out of it because the lens allows more light in, and it's a benefit for me and the person I'm taking photos for. Sigma is a really good lens brand when you're looking for lenses on a budget. A lot of people, when it comes to buying cinema lenses, which are crazy expensive, they actually go to Sigma because they produce a much cheaper line of lenses, which are still expensive, but when it comes to the Canon grade lenses, or even other brands of cine lenses, these are relatively cheap. Now this isn't a cine lens, this is a macro, which is different. Cinema lenses are incredibly expensive, and they're primarily, well, prime lenses. They don't zoom in and out just like this one. The main difference is the quality of the glass. Cine lenses are incredibly expensive because of the glass and also the aperture, how fast of an aperture they have. Those lenses can go down to like 1.2 of an f-stop at 85 millimeters, which is incredibly, it's awesome, but that's why they're so expensive. Not to mention, within the aperture of cine lenses, the aperture blades, there's more of them, and they're smoother. They're really silent when it comes to adjusting them. They're really smooth, and that's why they're so expensive. When you take a cinema lens and you use compression, things that are out of focus, like let's say lights, actually appear more round because there's more blades within the aperture. Now, when it comes to cine lenses, again, they're all prime. So when you buy cinema lenses, when you need to use different focal lengths, you have to use, well, different lenses. You have to use a bunch of different prime lenses, and that's where it gets really expensive because a single lens is expensive. Buying multiple is even more expensive. You need to check out your price range and see if buying a cinema lens is actually even reasonable. For me, as a photographer and someone who just shoots video, I don't need a cinema lens, although I would love to own one day. Honestly, you can stick to your simple lenses that you can buy at Canon or Nikon or Sony or whatever brand you use. Pro tip, when it comes to using the lenses, I suggest keeping the back and the front caps on at all time, just because it protects the lens so you don't have any problems with things being on the lens and then in your photos. That's really important when it comes to having a camera in general, is keeping the camera's internals clean and even the glass on your lenses clean. So I just like to switch out things. I don't like to keep the lenses just chilling anywhere, like on the desk. Nice. Because in the air, there's dust, and dust accumulates, and you don't want that on your glass, and you don't want to put that into your camera where it can get stuck on your sensor, and then you have these little artifacts just on your photos that are there in the same exact spot. It means your sensor is dirty. So keeping your lenses clean is gonna be really helpful in the long run. So that's everything for episode 2. We could only say so much about lenses. There are a lot of details that we could go over, but that would make this a really long video, and I'd rather not do that. So hit that like button, subscribe, smash it, leave a comment, have fun, ask me questions. Honestly, ask me questions. Ask me all the questions. And if I get a really good question, I'll make a video on it. How's that sound? I like that idea. It'll be fun. Have fun, guys. Stay creative, and I will see you guys in the next one.